Hello, and welcome to Real Mindful. This is where we speak mindfully about things that matter. We meet here to introduce you to some of the teachers, thinkers, writers, and researchers who are engaged in the mindfulness movement. You'll hear all kinds of conversations about the science of mindfulness, the practice of mindfulness, and the heart of it. If you caught our last episode, you know we're taking a pause with the podcast. That pause is still in effect, but we wanted to share a special episode with you. I'm Kylie Ross, Senior Editor at Mindful Magazine and mindful.org, and this is Real Mindful.
Well, I think Antigone really illustrates the circumstance that nurses find themselves in so often. You know, these competing obligations and the sort of moral residue that even when you do the right thing, there are consequences, and those consequences bear on our sense of who we are.
What can an ancient Greek play show modern audiences about the circumstances nurses have found themselves in over the course of the COVID-19 pandemic? That's the question you just heard Dr. Cynda Rushton beginning to answer, and it's the question she and Theater of War Productions hope will be answered when the Nurse Antigone premieres to audiences around the world. A project by and for nurses, the Nurse Antigone presents dramatic readings of Sophocles Antigone on Zoom, featuring professional actors and a chorus of frontline nurses to help frame discussions about the challenges faced by nurses before, during, and after the COVID-19 pandemic. Mindful's managing editor and your regular Real Mindful host, Stephanie Domet, connected with the organizers, and we're pleased to bring you that conversation on Real Mindful today.
Thank you both so much for joining me today for this conversation. I'm really excited to get a chance to spend some time with you and to hear about this project that you're working on. And so I think I'll start by just asking each of you to introduce yourselves. So say your name and kind of how you identify or how you locate yourself in this conversation. Cynda, I'll start with you.
So I'm Cynda Rushton. I'm a professor of nursing and bioethics at Johns Hopkins. And I am in this project because I am deeply committed to helping my profession heal in this pandemic.
And Bryan.
I'm Bryan Doerries. I'm the artistic director of Theater of War Productions. We are a social impact theater company that uses storytelling and theater as a tool for helping communities address issues of public health and social justice. And been collaborating with Cynda for some time and really excited to embark on this current project with her, where we're going to dive much deeper into the community that she serves and we hope to serve. As I'm sure you know, United States, there are roughly 4 million nurses alone who have been the most overexposed and under-resourced medical professionals during this pandemic. And it feels like a moral obligation to be focusing as much attention and energy and resources on them as humanly possible.
So I of course 100% agree with that. And you know, I feel like we're at a real pivotal moment in our profession, because of the incredible consequences of the pandemic that really just made so visible the fractures in our healthcare system, the ways in which we have regarded nurses' work and their contribution to health and healing, and that we don't want to miss the opportunity to make that visible in a different way, and also to invite the public to really bear witness to the experience of what it is to be a nurse at this time.
And so how will the Nurse Antigone help with that?
Well, the Nurse Antigone is a project that we're developing with nurses, by nurses, and for nurses at every level, as a way of doing two main things. One is communalizing the experience, not just of the COVID-19 COVID-19 pandemic, but of issues that predated the pandemic that, as Cynda mentioned, were accelerated by the pandemic, like pay inequality and exposure and lack of agency within healthcare systems and decision making, and institutions that put profit over humane care, that put nurses in the crosshairs of really challenging ethical decisions that then lead to moral distress and ultimately moral injury. And so on one level, the project is about creating a space. I'm not so interested in safe spaces because I'm not sure anything can be achieved in our world without risk. And I think nurses live that and embody that in their work. But a brave space, sorry, I'm in New York City, so at the street level, but a brave space where nurses can bear witness and to the truth of their experiences over the last 20 months and before, and think about the future as well, which is, I think, very hard in the eternal present of acute crisis. And the other thing is to create a platform and a vehicle for public discourse about the past, present, and future of nursing, and to let nurses tell their stories and be heard and validated, but also let empower nurses to lead that dialogue with the general public without the interference of institutions.
And why is Antigone the right text for this?
Well, Cynda's the one who actually suggested it some time ago. It's in our repertoire. We've been using Antigone for a number of other things, including racialized police violence with a project called Antigone and Ferguson. That has a very specific bent to it as a project. And Cynda pointed out to me that actually of all the plays that we perform in our repertoire, which are many Greek plays and ancient plays, Antigone speaks in some ways most forcefully to the question of moral injury, of which Cynda is an expert. So I defer to her as part two of this answer, because I think she knows it best.
Well, I think Antigone really illustrates the circumstance that nurses find themselves in so often. These competing obligations and it inevitable the sort of moral residue that even when you do the right thing, there are consequences, and those consequences bear on our sense of who we are, and that it really does require, it requires a kind of courage that is not about, it's not about being unintentional in that courage. It is actually razor focused courage around being able to live up to our values of what it means to be in this role. And I think it's going to really ignite some real connection for nurses that maybe they haven't even been able to articulate themselves, of why I show up every day and why I'm here and why it matters.
So our model is, we use ancient texts actually to create distance, not just to create resonance. The distance creates the space where people feel less defensive, where they can make their own connections, and where they can interpret the story on their own terms. We don't legislate what the story means to nurses or to the general public. We empower nurses to be the principal people helping us interpret the story, because they're closest in proximity to a series of issues that we think will illuminate the story in really powerful ways. But we have some hunches about ways that it'll resonate. Of course, Antigone is a young woman who puts everything on the line to do what she believes to be right, which is to bury her brother Polynices after a civil war has ended in Thebes, only milliseconds before the play begins. And against the edict of the new king Creon, she violates the law in order to do what she believes just and right. And in accordance with her law, which is the law of love, she says in the Greek, I was born not to hate, but to love, to sum philein, to bring together through love in the Greek. And this sacrifice, which ultimately ends with her losing her life, raises a whole series of questions. I think also illuminates the challenges of speaking out against institutional violence, and the misogyny that is baked into the play, I think, will resonate deeply with the structural and also overt misogyny that nurses, which are predominantly still women as a profession, have faced and continue to face. And also tragedy. You know, we don't perform tragedies to send people home to wallow in the their own lack of agency. We perform tragedies, as I presume the Athenians did in the 5th century BC, to wake people up to the slim possibility of making a change before it's too late. Not just nurses who may need energy and support to make critical changes to keep our healthcare system alive, but also the general public and their complicit role, the chorus that is the audience that's watching and is a bystander and has the ability to act. So one of the questions that's sort of intrinsic to tragedy is, does Antigone have to die in order to advance social change? Do these nurses that are now facing burnout at a scale never before imagined, and suicide and all kinds of other results of the last 2 years, compounded upon decades, if not centuries, of mistreatment by medical institutions, and these nurses who are now in some ways have been betrayed by the general public and by the breaking of a very fundamental social contract that existed between them and the general public. You know, do these nurses have to suffer in order for change to be effected? Or can a group of nurses perform Antigone instead? And then can we advance social change without actual suffering? And I really think that's the center of what Athenian drama was about. It presented scenes of suffering to a democratic populace that then could interrogate their own role in the suffering that they were watching. And that's what we're going to ask audiences to do as well. The play can both communalize the trauma as well as incite action and thought and reflection, mindfulness and interrogation around our role.
Are you going to overtly ask the audience to do that?
Yeah, so to be clear, the structure of our events is very simple, but it's not a theater production where we perform Antigone and then we call it a day. With all of our work, we kind of break the play that we're performing. It's never about polish. There's no production value. We're doing this on Zoom. People are dressed as themselves. Many of the nurses will come in their scrubs from their workday. Our actors aren't wearing costumes. Any money we would have put into production value is actually spent on audience cultivation to make sure that the right audience is in the room. We perform the play. It takes about 45 minutes. It's a sort of streamlined version, 50 minutes maybe. And then as soon as it's done, the actors, the professional actors, go away and are replaced by 4 or 5 nurses who are our second chorus. Our first chorus will actually be a chorus of nurses. Our second chorus will be our community panel, who will also be nurses and other people who have a vested interest in nurses. And they will respond from their hearts and their guts to what they heard in Antigone that resonated with them across time. There's no legislating what they'll say, and there are no wrong answers. They're modeling for the audience a candor and a way of moving forward and of using the vocabulary of the play to discuss something that maybe it was hard to discuss with our sort of current vocabulary. And then as soon as the community panelists, the second chorus is done, then I and other co-facilitators ask questions of the audience about the play. And the discussion, to be clear, lasts longer than the performance because the discussion is the main event. When people raise their hands and speak their truths and interpret the play and take the risk of being vulnerable and present with their own thoughts and not sounding brilliant. So we ask questions, and the questions are designed to sort of frame some of these themes that we've already laid out. And these questions will evolve over the 12 performances we have planned, because we'll be learning from the audience and from our nurse chorus all the way. And if we've done our work, then the structure of the whole thing sort of disappears and we disappear. And all of a sudden this dialogue between nurses takes place and between the general public takes place that would never have happened had we not performed Sophocles Antigone, which was really just a tool or a catalyst to get us to that place. And that's how it works. The whole event is a little around 2 hours from beginning to end.
Cynda, it sounds like it's a really powerful tool, a powerful experience. What can you say about you've worked with Bryan before. What can you say about your own experience of this kind of thing, or what have you seen or observed?
Well, what's interesting is I think it's easy to sort of start in your head, but you're very quickly drawn into your heart, into your own your own experience that maybe you haven't allowed yourself to acknowledge. Bryan's done performances around end of life issues, and I think that was the very first place where we connected, and giving voice to that complexity and the sacredness of being with people as they're dying, and and also, it is a way to articulate the inchoate part of our experience that we don't even know what to call it. And so that's been my experience every time. And there's this sense of there's an arc to it of all it takes is one person being willing to be vulnerable and to say what others are thinking out loud, that then releases and invites others to allow themselves to be a little more vulnerable and a little more honest about what really is true. And in this context, and you and I have talked about this, Stephanie, is part of the healing is we have to say what's true. Mm-hmm. And there have not been many places where nurses have felt they were able to say what's true. And so I hope this will be part of that catalyst to be able to really invite honest reflection, and also to ignite the possibility that we can transcend this suffering in some way, and that by coming together in this communal way, we can actually harness our goodness and our intentions and support each other to the next phase of our profession.
Bryan, you mentioned that you choose classical works because they offer distance, resonance, but really distance. Can you talk a little bit about why that distance is important, how it helps achieve what you're trying to do?
Yeah, so I think it's actually our principal tool. There are several tools that are intrinsic to tragedy, Athenian tragedy, but we do Shakespeare, we do contemporary plays, we do modern speeches and poems and things like that too. But the distance, whether it's cultural or temporal or both, is an immensely helpful tool when dealing with trauma and moral distress and loss and grief, and primarily because we're not saying to the audience, this is you. Uh-huh. We're asking the audience to reflect on what they see of themselves in the story. I would define tragedy as, especially Sophoclean tragedy, is stories about people who believe they're right. All the people in the play believe they're right. And because of their opposed, this is sort of Hegel's interpretation, but because of their opposed viewpoints and wills to achieve what they believe to be right, someone is going to die. And that's what happens to Antigone. And she's part of that because she believes she's right too, and is unrelenting, unflexible. I mean, there are ways the story can break open in ways. It's not a story of heroism. It's not a Christian allegory. There are ways that it can actually cause nurses to interrogate themselves too, in their own complicit role in the suffering of other nurses or their duties to their patients in ways that are also healthy. But the overarching themes of state and institutional violence against women, and women speaking out making the ultimate sacrifice in service of what they believe to be right, we know that'll resonate. And it's because of the strangeness of the tragedy, because of the dissonance of Greek tragedy, that the connections feel all the more powerful for audiences. And I just say that we've done this for 13 years. We deal with all kinds of audiences, many of them conservative, many of them who've never heard of theater before, or plays, or Sophocles. But I think watching these audiences over thousands of performances all over the world, there's been one takeaway over and over and over again, which is that when people see that their own struggles are as old as humanity itself, it lifts them out of isolation in this profound way. It's a public health message that you can't be told it, you have to discover it. And when you discover it, it brings people relief. So it's counterintuitive. We're performing tragedy for people who've experienced trauma. And there are a lot of people in the mental health world, even today, who hear about our work and say, oh, no, 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 no. Right. And certainly in the academic world, oh, no, we can't do that. That's dangerous. But in fact, the truth of the matter is, it can bring joy, a sense of connection, a sense of camaraderie. It can lift people out of isolation in a communal way to acknowledge the truth of the hardest things they've faced or are currently facing. So the common response that we have from audiences, and it's hard for them to hear these stories and hear each other's stories, but by and large is people buzzing with joy and with newfound sense of community, and with that ultimate realization that they are not alone across time. And that is the core. That's the thing that's one of the walls of the room that's afforded by distance. Seeing people make the discovery that they are not alone across time by engaging on their own terms with an ancient story that reflects in some way their experience back to them. But this is one of the reasons we are not a documentary theater company. There are a lot of ethical issues with, and I also think it's just fundamentally a stance of condescension on the part of theater artists to presume that they could in some way capture with verisimilitude the truth of the experience of, say, nurses or the military, or these really highly coded cultural experiences. So this is why what we do is the widest end of the funnel. Anyone can project their experiences onto Antigone. That's why even the title, the Nurse Antigone, already starts with a sort of provocation and a inquiry and a possible series of interpretations, but doesn't in any way resolve them. And that's what our work is about. And tragedy is an incredibly useful tool. The other tool is, and again, this is something that sometimes mental health professionals and people in the academy have a hard time accepting, but is like the full-throated depiction of human suffering.
Right. You're not pulling those punches.
No, and if the actors have done what I've asked them to do in rehearsal, and the note that I give them is make them wish they'd never come.
Yeah, right. And
not because we're trying to hurt the nurses or the people who are attending the performance, but because because the tool, aside from distance, that's most useful is discomfort, but it's not discomfort in isolation, it's shared discomfort. There's so many things that divide us in this world and in this country, in the United States in particular. But if we can make the commitment to stay in the room and be uncomfortable together, well, from my perspective, that's the beginning of real discourse. And it's why our model is structured the way it is, where we're not looking for an answer rhetorically to the questions we're asking. We're asking questions that have no one answer. and that honor the infinite possibility of interpretation in the room. No matter how repugnant we may find that interpretation to be, we acknowledge and honor the fact that everyone has the right to interpret an ancient story. And that democratizes the conversation. It creates a space where people can hear each other. It also creates a tent big enough to hold anti-vaxxers and nurses and people on the far right and members of the squad. In the last year, AOC tweeted about our work, and we got an award from a Republican mayor in rural Ohio that voted 72% as a county for Trump. And I would argue that that's because of distance, that and that by virtue of that distance and our reverence and humility for what audiences know that we can't possibly understand until they interpret the play on their own terms, that we're able to achieve something that very few public spaces are able to achieve and hold.
Cynda, what's going through your mind?
Well, one of the beautiful things about this method, as Bryan points out, is the discovery part of it. And, you know, the connection with, you know, sort of mindfulness is really an invitation to notice your own experience and
Right.
your own responses, and to pay attention to that, not to judge it, but just to notice. You know, I think in many ways, progress is predicated on being uncomfortable, because we can become so devoted to the status quo that we don't even recognize what we are participating in, and also the ways in which we are missing opportunities to do something different. And so much of what I end up doing in other spaces is really the same thing of discovering. It's inviting people into a place of discovery and discomfort for the purpose of insight, of being able to see things with new eyes, to be able to inquire, and, as Bryan says, interrogate their own experience and the experience of others. And right now, I think the piece around the isolation, I hear this so often with nurses who are working side by side, and they believe that they're the only ones that are struggling. And there's something so important about saying, we're all in this together and we are all suffering. And that it's not because we're weak, it is because we care. And so it's a really, it's a powerful tool to get out of our heads and into our hearts and guts, as Bryan would say, to kind of shift out of, you know, that sense of, for many people, I think everybody's either locked down, completely locked down, we're not feeling anything at all, or we're feeling so much that we don't know how to hold that either. And so I think there's a way that this offers a path for some relief. And I think Bryan's right. A lot of times at the end, it is this, there's a kind of hope that springs forth at the end of, oh, I'm not alone, and what I'm experiencing is normal in a way.
Yeah, we've had people say, you know, from various walks of life, they came expecting something inaccessible and effete, and they were intimidated. People maybe who don't have a lot of education, you know, people who don't have a lot of education turn out to be our best audiences because they don't have the baggage of the structures of oppression that are built into higher education and interpretation. It's more direct for them. But they have to discover on their own terms. So I remember a military couple after one of our earliest performances who had gone out and tried to read this play by Sophocles they were performing and couldn't get through like the first 10 pages and basically given up. And then when the performance happened, it just went straight past the forebrains and right to the amygdala. And they came up during the discussion and they said, that wasn't poetry. That was something I said to my wife in our kitchen last night. And, we worry about the uncomfortable part for people who've already experienced extreme discomfort. But in fact, the ones who are most uncomfortable, the ones who are furthest in proximity to the suffering we're describing, what I see when people who've suffered watch the plays, who've experienced something similar, is people often smiling while watching the plays, smiling with recognition, smiling with validation, smiling that finally something, because we hear most often, I talk about my experiences to people who haven't had them, but it just takes so much damn energy. And the plays provide the energy. They juice the room or the virtual space with an energy, a field of energy. And that energy and the syntax and the vocabulary of the play create the possibility of this opening. It's not therapy. I do think this shares some things with mindfulness. I think that it's interesting to both celebrate the idea and also sort of interrogate it, because I think it's like a radical non-judgment with regard to your own response and the responses of others by virtue of that to what you've just watched, observation of your own, but it's not pulling back in any way from the idea of experiencing extreme emotion. One of the, and not to get too theoretical, but one of the things I really have, thought a lot about over the last 13 years is, when you're emotionally activated, I think maybe it's been just because Plato went so hard with his Republic on the idea that poets manipulate our thoughts and thereby are sort of poisonous to democratic institutions, and they can, and the media can. But the other thing that poets can do is connect us with the emotions that we should be feeling, but don't allow ourselves to feel, so that we can actually have the rigorous ethical conversation that we need to have, which can only happen when we're connected with the emotional and spiritual consequences of the decisions we're talking about and debating.
I mean, ideally, mindfulness is doing that too.
Yeah, absolutely.
The way we talk about it at Mindful, it's not to turn away from anything that arises. It's to go in with curiosity and radical non-judgment.
And the way that mindfulness, at least my experience of it, has also a sort of foregrounded interdependence as a sort of value. I think that is that it's not the plays per se, it's the architecture of Greek drama. Sitting in the amphitheater, surrounded by other people, shoulder to shoulder, who may have experienced these things, and then collectively facing them while watching characters who were all playing roles, and then being able to, maybe for a fleeting second, dispassionately step back from the roles that we're playing. And by virtue of that, maybe have a space enter where we can think before our next decision about whether we're making it based on automatic thinking or because of something we've been told or taught, or can we take off these costumes for a moment and engage with each other on a more direct level? And I do think there's a lot to be said about short of giving Marines, who have been an audience for us for many years, a psychotropic drug, I don't think you're going to see them open up in the way that they do at our performances. I'm convinced that this is a technology, a psycho-spiritual or psychotropic technology. So that's why I say theater is kind of a red herring. Theater is something we consume. Theater is something we purchase. We go to the theater, and in the theater, we are silenced. We're plunged into darkness. 19th century, 20th century naturalism is predicated on the audience never being heard. And then the cinema takes over and just makes that ubiquitous. We go into dark spaces to watch stories play out before us in which we are not invited to be part of it. And our model is about, and this where Zoom and in fact the pandemic accelerated our model into this digital amphitheater we've now created, where we turn the lights on. And the word amphitheater in Greek means I see you, you see me. We see amphi in both directions. And the theatron is the seeing place. In some ways, Greek tragedy plus Zoom equals an amphitheater that Sophocles couldn't have imagined. But
what a time to be alive.
but it's an extension, and then plus cataclysm, right?
Yeah.
But the Greeks who were watching Sophocles' Oedipus, for instance, which is our pandemic project, which Cynda has been part of, knows, would have watched in 429 BC a play that deals with a plague as a central part of the play during the second wave of a plague.
Mm-hmm.
So themes like ignored prophecy and failed leadership and arrogance and institutional breakdowns and, the habitual clinging to behaviors, all these things that are at the center of what we've experienced. There's no question in my mind that the play would have resonated in those ways for the Athenian audience. If you read Thucydides' depiction of the Athenian plague, and you run it up against Sophocles' depiction of the Theban plague, and then you run it up against what we've just experienced and what nurses are experiencing. So, here is a technology that was designed to communalize and evolve to communalize many different traumas and experiences, but one of them being the experience of pestilence, and watching helplessly as people that you love and care for die. And so there's one last thing I wanted to say about the play and why I know it'll resonate and why Cynda was so right to sort of suggest that we do it. And that's that the play is fundamentally about the burying of Antigone's brother. And the burying of Antigone's brother, Polynices, is about grief. And robbing someone of the ability to bury their brother is deferring the possibility of their grieving. And there are so many ways, in quite literal and also metaphorical ways, that nurses have been deprived the capacity to grieve.
Yeah.
So true, Bryan. It is so true. And, when you think about the consequences of the pandemic, one of the things that has really weighed so heavily on nurses is patients dying alone. And the the sense of lack of dignity of the numbers of people who died, and not being able to do that in a way that reflected dignity and respect for the ending of that human life. And those elements of grief are compounded by loss of identity, loss of relationships with people on their team, loss of people who they worked beside who died because they showed up with COVID. And so there is this sense of disenfranchised grief that nurses have carried again and again and again, that feels important to honor that in a different way. So we'll see.
That's Dr. Cynda Rushton, Bryan Doerries, and Stephanie Domet. The Nurse Antigone begins Thursday, March 17th, featuring Taylor Schilling, Margaret Atwood, a chorus of nurses, and you. You can find out more at theaterofwar.com. We'll add the link to our show notes for you. If you enjoyed this episode of Real Mindful, perhaps you would leave us a review. You can find us on Spotify, iTunes, Google Podcast, or wherever you're listening from. Your review helps other listeners decide whether Real Mindful is right for them, and we'd love to hear from you. Let us know what you thought of this episode of Real Mindful. You can drop us a line at yourwords@mindful.org. And did you know we have a weekly podcast called 12-Minute Meditation? 12 minutes of meditation practice a day is enough to yield benefits like increased focus, clarity, calm, and compassion, and we want to help you with that. So each week we deliver a fresh mindfulness practice directly to your ears from a leading mindfulness expert. You can subscribe to 12-Minute Meditation wherever fine podcasts are found. We'll be back before long with another episode of Real Mindful for you, and until then, may you notice your own experience and pay attention, not to judge it, but just notice it.